Imagine paying more for a block of frozen water than most people earned in a week. Now imagine an entire industry built around cutting that frozen water out of lakes, wrapping it in sawdust, loading it onto ships, and sailing it halfway around the world before it melted. It sounds absurd. It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but this actually happened, and for a brief, strange window in history, ice became one of the most valuable commodities on Earth, a business that made ordinary men millionaires, reshaped entire cities, and connected continents that had never before shared something as simple as a cold drink. For almost the entirety of human history, ice was something you only had in winter, and only if you happened to live somewhere cold. If you lived in the tropics or anywhere warm, ice simply didn't exist in your world. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, milk soured within hours, fevers had to be endured without anything to cool the body down. Cold, in the way we understand it today, was a luxury reserved for a tiny sliver of the wealthiest people on the planet. Those who could afford elaborate underground ice houses stocked each winter with snow and ice hauled down from distant mountains at extraordinary expense. The Persians had been doing something remarkable with this idea for over 2,000 years. In the deserts of ancient Persia, engineers built extraordinary structures called yakchals, tall domed buildings designed to trap and preserve ice through blistering hot summers using nothing but clever architecture, shade, and evaporative cooling. It's a stunning piece of ancient engineering, proof that even in a place with no natural ice at all, human ingenuity found a way to manufacture cold out of nothing. But across most of the world, ice remained something you simply couldn't get once summer arrived. And then, in the early 1800s, a young man from Boston looked at a frozen New England pond and saw something nobody else had ever quite seen before, a fortune waiting to be shipped. His name was Frederic Tudor, and today historians sometimes call him the Ice King. In 1806, Tudor had an idea so strange that his own family reportedly thought he'd lost his mind. He proposed cutting large blocks of ice from frozen ponds in New England, packing them onto a ship, and sailing them to the Caribbean to sell to people who had never in their lives touched anything cold. People laughed at him. Newspapers mocked the plan openly. Nobody believed that ice, a substance that melted the moment the sun touched it, could possibly survive a long ocean voyage through tropical heat. Tudor's first shipment to the island of Martinique in 1806 was, by most measures, a disaster. A huge portion of the ice melted before it ever reached land, and Tudor lost a significant amount of money. It should have ended there. It didn't. Tudor kept experimenting, kept refining, kept trying again despite years of financial losses that would have crushed almost anyone else. He eventually landed on a discovery that seems obvious now, but was revolutionary at the time: insulating the ice in sawdust. Sawdust, a cheap waste product readily available from any sawmill, turned out to be an extraordinary insulator, trapping cold air around the ice and dramatically slowing the melting process during long voyages. With that single innovation, everything changed. By the 1830s, Tudor's ice was surviving voyages not just to the Caribbean, but all the way to India, a trip that could take 4 to 5 months across some of the hottest stretches of ocean on the planet. And astonishingly, a meaningful percentage of that ice was still frozen solid when it arrived. You'd think shipping ice around the globe would be the strangest part of this story. It actually gets stranger, because as demand exploded, an entire industry sprang into existence almost overnight around America's frozen lakes and ponds. Every winter, teams of laborers known as ice cutters would head out onto frozen New England lakes with horse-drawn saws and massive iron blades, cutting the ice into uniform blocks weighing hundreds of pounds each. It was brutal, dangerous work. Men fell through thin ice. Fingers and limbs were lost to enormous saw blades. Entire local economies in towns across Massachusetts and Maine grew up almost entirely around this seasonal harvest. The blocks were hauled to massive ice houses, some large enough to store tens of thousands of tons of ice at once, packed tightly in sawdust and left to wait for shipment. And from there, they were loaded onto ships bound for ports as far away as Calcutta, Rio de Janeiro, Hong Kong, and New Orleans. By the mid-1800s, ice had become one of the largest export industries in the United States. It was, quite literally, frozen water turned into liquid gold. Fortunes were built on it. Boston Harbor at points saw more tonnage of ice leaving its docks than nearly any other export. And in places that received this ice, something remarkable happened to daily life. In cities like Calcutta, where temperatures could soar well past 100 degrees, the arrival of American ice wasn't just a novelty. It transformed how people lived. Cold drinks became possible for the first time in places that had never known them. Doctors used ice to treat fevers and reduce inflammation for patients who otherwise had no way to cool a dangerously overheated body. Wealthy households in tropical port cities began building their social lives around access to this strange, expensive imported substance from thousands of miles away. But nobody expected what happened next. As demand grew, cities themselves became obsessed with ice, and America's own growing urban population needed it just as badly as the Caribbean and India did. Ice wasn't just for the rich anymore. As cities like New York and Chicago exploded in population during the mid to late 1800s, ice became essential infrastructure used to preserve meat, dairy, and produce that would otherwise spoil before it ever reached a dinner table. An entirely new profession emerged, the Iceman, delivering blocks of ice door to door to fill the ice boxes that had become standard in middle-class kitchens across America. For decades, the Iceman cometh wasn't just a phrase. It was a literal daily event in millions of households, as families waited for their regular delivery to keep food from rotting in the summer heat. The natural ice industry seemed unstoppable. And that's when everything changed, because relying on frozen lakes came with an obvious, glaring vulnerability. What happens during a warm winter? In certain years during the late 1800s, unusually mild temperatures across the American Northeast meant lakes simply didn't freeze thick enough to harvest, triggering genuine ice shortages and panicked price spikes in cities that had grown entirely dependent on a steady winter harvest. That vulnerability opened the door for a competitor. Nobody in the natural ice business wanted to admit was coming: mechanical refrigeration. Scientists and engineers throughout the 1800s had been steadily improving artificial refrigeration technology, building on principles of compression and evaporation first explored decades earlier. By the later part of the century, mechanically produced ice, manufactured in factories regardless of the weather outside, began appearing as a serious rival to the natural ice harvested from frozen ponds. At first, natural ice companies dismissed the new technology, insisting their product, pure lake ice, was superior and that customers would always prefer it. That confidence turned out to be badly misplaced. Mechanical ice didn't depend on cold winters. It didn't require dangerous harvesting operations or massive storage houses. It could be produced consistently in any climate at any time of year, which made it enormously appealing to businesses that could no longer afford the unpredictability of relying on nature's cooperation. By the early 1900s, the natural ice trade that Frederic Tudor had built from nothing was already in serious decline, and within just a few more decades it had all but disappeared, replaced almost entirely by mechanical ice plants and eventually by home refrigerators. It's a strange twist of fate. An industry that had once seemed almost magical, shipping literal frozen lakes across oceans to melt slowly in tropical ports, was wiped out not by some dramatic collapse, but by a quieter, steadier technology that simply didn't need winter to exist. Refrigeration itself kept evolving through the 20th century, moving from industrial ice plants into household refrigerators that eventually became standard in homes across the developed world by the mid-1900s. What had once been an impossible luxury, cold air on demand inside your own kitchen, became something almost nobody thinks twice about today. So the next time you drop ice cubes into a glass without a second thought, remember what that simple act represents. It represents a young man from Boston who was mocked for believing frozen ponds could be turned into a global commodity. It represents laborers who risked frostbite and drowning to cut blocks from frozen lakes by hand. It represents ships that carried literal chunks of winter across the equator, packed in sawdust, racing against the clock before they melted into nothing. And it represents a quiet, mechanical revolution that eventually made all of that unnecessary. Ice was once worth more, pound for pound in certain markets, than almost anything else you could ship. Today, it's something we barely notice, sitting in a glass, slowly melting, carrying inside it one of the strangest and most ambitious commodity stories in human history.